So now we're going to create our distress background, and I am using a piece of 8.5 by 11 mixed media cardstock. You need to use cardstock that can handle some wetness, because for this it is going to get wet, and if you use regular cardstock it will not react in the same way. I am using Festive Berries, Candied Apple, and Aged Mahogany in both the regular distress as well as the Oxide. So I'm going to take each one of them and press them down in a couple places. Now, the reason I am using both the regular distress as well as the Oxide is because I like the look of the two of them together. If you just had one type of ink pad, you can absolutely go ahead and just use what you have. I am using the same mat that I used for the well, pretty much the background of all of it. I like it because it's nice and easy to clean up, as well as the fact that when I'm doing these distress backgrounds, see how all the ink kind of goes into these little dots? I like how it does that. So for the first layer, I'm just going to try to get my entire sheet covered with ink. Now, typically for distress backgrounds, you wouldn't put it in this many times without or before using your heat gun, but I am going to. One second, I've got to get this one plugged in now. So the heat gun that I'm using for this one is just a heat it tool. It's much gentler than a regular heat gun for embossing. You'll notice it's a lot quieter as well. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to dry my surface. It does not need to be 100% dry. About 80 to 90% is good. You just want it mostly dry, because what I'm going to do after it's dry is I'm going to tap it into some of these dots here, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to just create a bigger puddle. So I just tried to move my mat away so that I can dry this off of those. I don't want to be drying those or playing with those. So you could use just solid red cardstock for this if you wanted. I wanted to do a distressed background because I like the mottled look, and I think it's going to look a lot more interesting and have a lot more texture than just plain flat red cardstock. All right, so this is mostly dried. This is completely wet here, and this is completely wet here. For right now, that's okay. If it gets in my way, I will make sure that it's dried. Once this is completely covered, we're going to be doing die cutting anyways. So there's a lot of this that we're not going to see. We're going to be die cutting our poinsettias out of this piece here. And then we're also going to, once the die cuts are completely done, we're just going to ink the centers of the poinsettias to make sure that they're a bit of a darker shade. You can see my cardstock is curling, even though it is meant for moisture, and that is totally fine. I find as the ink gets a little bit more concentrated, it takes a little bit longer to dry each time as well. So I typically do this 2 to 3 times, depending on coverage. If I want it more covered, I'll do it more than that. If I'm liking the spots and the effect that I'm getting, I will leave it at that. I'm just going to flatten this a little bit. And because this is just a background that's being die cut, I'm not really too worried about it being completely perfect in any way, shape, or form. I just like the different dots. I like the different colors blending to each other. I think it just looks a little bit more interesting. Now, like I said, I have a heat tool here that's a lot more gentle, and the intent of it is to dry things. You could use this heat gun for embossing the embossing powder as well. It's just because it's a gentler heat, it's going to take a little bit longer to do that embossing, but it absolutely will work. And for the amount of embossing that we're doing in this particular project, I would definitely just do it with the same heat gun. I don't think you necessarily need a separate one just to do that embossing. Okay, my paper is a little bit curled, so it's fighting back a bit, but that's okay. So I'm going to heat this last bit. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to add a little bit more of the dots in that corner there because it kind of missed that area, and so they look a little bit plain there. So once this is completely dry, like I said, I'm going to do some die cutting for the poinsettias. We're going to end up with more poinsettias than we actually need for our project, but that's okay because then you can pick and choose which ones you prefer, which ones you like a little bit better. And I always prefer to have extra die cuts than run out. And you could use different colors than the ones that I used, than the reds that I used. The one thing though is I'm using distress pads. They are intended to create this look and to have this effect and to react with water. Other ink pads are not necessarily meant to do that same thing. So you may have other dye ink pads, but they may not get the same reaction as these. All right, so this is going to be definitely going to be my last layer. So I'm going to partially dry it. I'm not going to even completely dry it, just because it's going to be my last layer. So I'm going to let it air dry. We definitely don't want to be doing any die cutting while it's partially wet. So I'm going to let the rest of that air dry. So this is another version of these that I made, and I ended up not using this. I was gonna use these for this one here, but they ended up turning out a little bit too peachy for my liking, which I think would look really, really pretty with some rose gold accents, but they didn't really suit gold, I thought anyways. So I have those aside. I'm gonna use them for a different project. These are the blue ones that I did here, and I'll put on the supply list the different colors that I used for this. So if you wanted to create the blue and silver look, you absolutely could. The process is exactly the same as what I'm showing you here, just different colors. All right, so this is mostly dry, but I do have some wet drips there. I am going to set this aside so that it can completely dry. And then the next step to that is I'm going to cut this in half just because this entire sheet won't go into my die cutting machine. And then I'm going to die cut my poinsettias out of here. We'll see you in the next video.